If you have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to add those questions in our chat box, and then Tim will be taking the time to go over those questions throughout the webinar today. So just to introduce you to who is presenting, we are the TPE Employer Development Team, and so we are a team underneath the TPE at Large Planning Committee that comes together to work specifically with our employers who are posting, attending the TPE on-site experience, which is taking place in Austin this year. So my name is Erin Mickles, and I currently serve as the Associate Director for Recruitment and Staff Development at Loyola University, Maryland, and I also serve as the Chair of the Employer Development Committee. And I'll allow Tim to introduce himself.
Good morning, good afternoon, good day, wherever you're at in the world. My name is Dr. Timothy Layson. I serve as an Associate Director of Residence Life at Santa Cruz University, and I'm a member of the TPE Employer Development Team.
We have one more special person that we would like to allow to introduce themselves, and that is Kirsten Fox, who serves as the Director of TPE.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Kirsten Fox, the Director of the Placement Exchange, and looking forward to seeing everybody in Austin. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Kirsten.
All right, so for employers, we just wanted to remind you of some upcoming important dates for your timelines. Currently the early bird registration is open until January 10th. I apologize, my camera's all over the place. It's open until January 10th. So you still have a little bit of time to decide what you're going to be doing with interviews and all the different packages that we offer. As that is occurring, you'll want to finalize all table orders by January 12th. So as you're beginning to finalize what your interview experience is going to look like for the on-site experience, those are two key dates. And then shortly right after that, you want to make sure that you add all of your interview team, and Arian will probably go over this during the portion of her presentation today. And then you won't be able to start scheduling candidates until February 1st. So there is a little bit of time between scheduling your scheduling interviews and all that. So and then the interview hall service deadline is February 21st. So if you need any shipping needs or anything like that, you'll want to make sure that you're staying within those dates. So we give you these dates just to make sure that in terms of your own institutional timeline and development that you're keeping these in mind for your own budget tracking and from a TPE perspective.
Thank you, Tim. So really, as we look at what we're discussing today, we are really focusing on the recruitment cycle as a series of processes. And so the processes that we'll be focusing on today are your interview structure and questions. So diving into what type of questions you'll be asking, how many rounds of questions or how many interview rounds you'll be covering, and then the structure of your team specifically as they are doing the interviews. We'll also be talking about training your recruitment team and the importance of doing that, especially before on-site. And then creating and developing effective candidate communication plans. Something that we have heard consistently from our candidates who attend TPE is that they aren't feeling that they are communicated with effectively. So we want to have that conversation now so that you can start developing your candidate communication plan as we move forward. So when thinking about specifically your interview structure, the first thing you really want to start thinking about is your actual timeline. Like, what is my team's timeline for whatever position that we are hiring for? That will determine really what your interview rounds look like specifically. So giving an example on how my current institution does interview rounds, we will do a matrix review of the candidates' resumes. Then whoever we want to interview, we'll do a first round Skype interview with. So all of our first rounds are via Skype or Zoom. And then we'll go on to doing right on to on-campuses. You will need to sit down with your recruitment team and looking at the positions that you are hiring for to determine with your timeline, how many interview rounds are we doing? and then what those rounds will look like specifically. Some things to consider when developing your vast timeline is, are we doing phone screens? There are some institutions that do phone screens prior to offering first round interviews. A phone screen could be with the hiring manager, it could be with members of your recruitment team, and it really is just a quick phone conversation. You also may need to talk to your human resources team to determine what your process for phone screens are, maybe institutionally. Also determining after that, are you doing first rounds and second rounds or just first rounds? And then what will they look like? Will they be over the phone, or will they be on some sort of video messaging process, whether that's Skype or Zoom? And then TPE on-site. So the reason that we're here, really big, is really talking about TPE, and understanding that TPE itself is a smaller process within your overarching recruitment process that you're doing throughout the academic year. So you really want to sit and think about, when planning on-site, we have interviews taking place there, but are you doing both your first rounds and your second rounds on-site? If you have both of those, we also have seen some institutions do 3 rounds at on-site. So if you're doing a first round, a second round, and a third round, which could be a meeting of the candidates you want to invite to campus with the director or the assistant director of your department, that is something you need to start thinking about now as you're planning out your interview structure. And then your interviews that are taking place. And that is just talking about on-site. Some institutions will do their first rounds before they get to TPE on-site, so that you are maximizing your time at TPE on-site with just doing your second rounds. And then by the time you end at TPE on-site, you're offering your on-campus interviews. There's also the opportunity to do on-site and then have a part of your recruitment team to be back home, also doing Skype interviews. And so maximizing your time being at multiple locations. But these are pieces of your interview structure that you want to think about, because once you've determined how many rounds do I have, that will help you to maximize your recruitment team's time. And so are you devoting a certain amount of folks from your team to your first round interviews, another subset to your second round interviews, and then taking a different team to on-site? Or depending on the size of your recruitment team, are you using everyone for every single round, which means you also need to plan out their timing as well, knowing that the rest of your job doesn't stop. You're still having to do whatever you need to do at work on a daily basis on top of this recruitment process. And then once you've determined really your interview round setup, that'll help you determine your interviewer setup. So if you're doing phone screens, how many individuals are in that phone screen? Is it just one person from your recruitment team, or is it 2? In your first rounds and in your second rounds, also, how many folks do you have interviewing? We typically suggest that you have at minimum 2 folks, just to also pull out any biases that may happen while doing the interview process. Leaving it just to one person doesn't allow for any conversation or difference in opinion as it comes to the candidate. So are you doing 2 to 3 folks in your first rounds or second rounds? And then that goes on to also your on-campus interviews. Are you looking to have 3 to 4 to 5 individuals in your interview setup when it comes to on-campuses? It's really good to start having those conversations now, so that you can start having conversations with campus partners or whoever you're inviting to help in those interview pieces. And really, from department to department, even if you're a residence life at one institution to a different institution, you need to figure out the structure that's going to work best for your institution and for your team. So some institutions have a department of 40 to 50 people, so they can have a recruitment team of 10 and be able to disperse their recruitment team members to different aspects of the interview process. Some institutions can only make a team of 4 to 5, and all 4 or 5 of those individuals are doing every step of the process until it comes to on-campuses, where you are leaning a lot more on on-campus partners versus the larger institutions, which may not need to lean as heavily on campus partners. However, they still should be using campus partners in the interview process. Okay, so I will pause there and see if there are any questions that have come in thus far, as well as if Tim has any insights that he would like to add in as it relates to your interview structure format.
No questions at this time, but I think Arian hit everything right on the head with all of the things to consider. I think it's also, if you're doing an institutional team, so if there are multiple positions open within your student life or student affairs division, and you're coming as an institution, like what does that look like as part of your interview process? And how are you all working together at that time?
All right. Thanks, Tim. So next is really thinking about, once you've developed or determined what your interview structure is, or how many rounds of interviews you're having, this is where you really need to start diving into your interview questions and really specifying for each round, what questions are you asking? One thing to think about before you dive into your interview questions is look at your job description. And Tim discussed in our previous Ed Live, talking about who you're recruiting for and what type of candidates are you looking for. And so if you want to go on our TPE YouTube channel, you can see that Ed Live webinar, but you really want to work with your team to clearly define what it is that you are looking for specifically in a candidate. That will help to frame your questions, because your questions should get to what you're looking for in a candidate. So if you are looking for a candidate who is forward thinking, there should be some type of question in your interview process that gauges forward thinking. So the first thing to start with is, once you know your interview structure, you really want to formulate standard questions. There are some interviews that we've heard, especially from our candidates and even working in this field as employers, where they kind of let the interviewers go rogue in the interview process. So they send them in and there are no standard questions. It is beneficial to have standard questions. One, again, to pull out any biases that may take place, but also all of your candidates should be hearing the same questions. And then you really want to think about your question types. A lot of institutions like to go with the behavioral-based or the experience-based questions. And so when you're doing experience-based questions, those are really focusing on candidates responding to questions through an example of something they've already done or how they've handled a situation in the past. It's also good to balance out those questions specifically with some questions about what would you do, to really see how they may do in your specific role in your institution. Because thinking about, from my perspective, being in residence life, how a candidate handled an incident on call at a previous institution may be slightly different than how they may handle it here, given the insights of my institution or my current institution. So is there a way I can ask questions that ask what they've done in the past, but also extend some of those questions or ask more questions on how would you do that here? Or how can I put you into a scenario-based question so that I'm clearly getting the answers to what I'm looking for in a candidate and trying to figure out what I'm looking for in a candidate. So you really want to talk to your team also as you're formulating your questions. How can you diversify your question types? So are there some questions where there is more thought kind of put into it, where they're thinking specifically about handling a situation or scenario? Your questions, as you and your team are discussing, you should be able to go through each of your questions and answer for yourself as a team. What is this question providing for me? If you're looking at a question and you're thinking about whatever answer I get to this question will not be helpful at all, then you're wasting both your time and the candidate's time with that specific question. So really make sure that you are making the best use of your time and the candidate's time when it comes to the questions that you're asking. And then also being realistic with how many questions can be answered in a certain amount of time. So if you are hosting a 30-minute first round interview with 15 to 16 questions, you're giving your candidate, and also if you want to give them time to ask you questions, kind of giving your candidate a few seconds to be able to answer a question, which doesn't allow them to also think about the question. So really figuring out, what do I need from a first round interview to be able to determine if a candidate is going on to a second round and or an on-campus interview, and then get to those questions. That way, whatever questions you feel you haven't gotten to in the first round, you can then talk to your team about a second round or the on-campus interview and capturing the rest of the questions that you want to ask. And then when looking at each of those questions, you also then want to dive into, how can I personalize these questions? And I know that I keep speaking from a lens of being in residence life, but no matter what functional area you're in, personalize your questions specifically to the role, because a residence director at my current institution is vastly different from a residence director at my previous institution, so our questions are different. And so making sure that your questions no matter if there are other positions at TPE or just around the world that are hiring for the same role that you are, there's still some difference being how you coordinate or explain your role, your department, and then also your institution. And so, for example, I know that Tim and I are both at Jesuit institutions, and so we always have questions for our candidates that relate to a Jesuit institution. Another thing that I would also caution from that we hear from our candidates are the questions that are gauging how much the candidate knows about your institution. And so is it helpful to ask a question that says, how much do you know about us? Because does that say more about the candidate, or does that say more about us as an institution not thoroughly giving our candidates information on our institution? So it's not particularly fair to ask a candidate, what do you know about us? And really testing them on their research of the institution when we haven't gauged how much information we are given to our candidates. Now, if you're asking about something that you have shared with them, then that's different. But you haven't given them any information or any context about the institution. It's not entirely fair to ask the candidate, just what do you know about us? But also thinking about how useful is it to us as employers, how much the candidate knows about our specific institution. Unless, for example, there are things like with Tim and I working at Jesuit institutions, if they have done no research on Jesuit institutions at all, then that can tell us something. But we do still need to be cautious about how we're looking at how much research the candidate has done on a specific institution. And so really, when you're looking at your interview questions, it's gauging to make sure that those questions are getting at the answers of what you are looking for in a candidate, and they are very specific to what you are looking for in the candidates that you and your team have decided on. Okay, I will pause again to allow Tim, if there are any questions, any more insights that you may have.
No questions from the audience. I would say really making sure that I think with your questions, thinking about what are the themes that you're trying to get out of. So maybe if we have 6 themes for a 30-minute interview, then each question relates to that theme. I think Arian's really on the money with trying to avoid the rogue questions. I think making sure that you are creating a question bank that at the end of the day, you all will be able to use and create an effective candidate profile when it comes to that hiring decision. Whether you're in Res Life or any other department, I think that's the most important thing. You want your questions to really reflect the nature of the work that you're hiring for.
Yeah, and when it comes to those rogue questions, you really want to make sure that that's going to come with your training, but making sure that you talk to your team about the avoidance of rogue questions or just asking whatever questions they would like, because if they ask a question to one candidate, then they're going to need to ask that question to another candidate to be in line with HR standards. And there's a difference between asking a rogue question and asking a probing question. And then that'll also, again, come with training that you give to your recruitment team about how to, if you ask the question and posed it and a candidate doesn't exactly answer the question, you can probe, which may be reiterating a part of the question, but you only give them that one time because you don't want to keep pushing to try to give them an answer or get them to get the answer that you're looking for, because then that isn't fair to the other candidates. But you are allowed to kind of probe and just ask again if they didn't give a piece of the question. All right, so I think a part that is really fun for both Tim and I is the training of your recruitment team. And the training of your recruitment team really comes as soon as you put those folks together. Thinking about, once you have selected your team and thought about your team, something to think about is what experience do you hope to create? Because the experience you hope to create is kind of that background on how you're training your team. So one conversation that you need to have from the very beginning is, what are you looking for in a candidate? And we're going to probably keep reiterating that because it is the backbone of kind of your recruitment process, is what are you looking for in a candidate? It is imperative to have a conversation and to train your team on what you're looking for in a candidate, because I think from my experience and from Tim and I's experience is that everyone goes into a kind of a search process with their own idea of what they're looking for in a candidate, whether it's someone that they could potentially be supervising, whether it's someone that they could be working with as a colleague or someone who is going to come in and do the same role as them. If it's an inaugural position and no one has ever done the role, but the folks who are hiring helped create the role, everyone kind of comes in with a different idea of what they're looking for in a candidate. And so you need to start your team off by getting on one accord about what are we all looking for universally in a candidate, because that sets the precedent for the entire remainder of our process. Next thing you need to focus on is you are doing an interview process. And so how to actually host interviews, how to have an interview, how to be fair in an interview process. And some of that may go all the way down to some folks have never done an interview on the side of the employer. They've always been the candidate. So they know it's probably good to have a conversation with your team about when you were a candidate, what were things that you enjoyed? What were things that were kind of, scary or things that I didn't like in the search process from the employer side? And that gaining that will help your team to know what they shouldn't do in the interview process. But it also may need to go as much as sitting with your team and doing some mock interviews so that they can also learn their interviewer style. There are some folks out there who interviewing style is, I don't want to give the candidate too much. And so I'm going to be blank face the whole interview time and not really give too much personality, which to some candidates can be terrifying. And so as someone who used to be that person, never smiled in an interview, like as an employer, it's scary. And so you really want to sit with your team, talk to them about the presence they give off in an interview. But you also have to talk to your recruitment team about also being the other side of an interviewer and being the one that gives off that feeling of you're amazing, you're great to every candidate, because that also sets a false precedent to your candidates. And it can be deemed as being nice, like I'm being nice to all the candidates, but realistically, candidates will get the feel of I did amazing, I'm going to get this next round, and then the surprise that'll come. So how can you reach a middle ground in your interviewing to be that I'm trying to be as objective as possible in doing this interview while also giving some personality? And so sitting down with your team and being able to have that conversation on focus on the questions, be open to the candidate, but at the same time, don't be so open to the candidate that you're giving off that they got this job automatically. But also don't be so stern that they're terrified and automatically think this employer didn't like me. So it's one of those things that is a constant conversation to be had, and your interviewers will need to gauge the candidates to really see that and kind of understand that. So that is a deeper conversation to be had with your team. And so it's helpful to do mock interviews so that you can also give them feedback as an interviewee to the other members of your team and say, this is how it kind of came off to me, so this is how it could come off to our candidates. It's also important to do some form of implicit bias training with your team, just because we all have different potential biases that can come into the interview process. And if you do any research on interviewing in general, you'll see a list of different pitfalls that could happen when it comes to interviewing. These are conversations that we want to have with our team before it comes to interviewing. One of the biggest ones that can happen is favoritism. And so being able to have that conversation ahead of time with our employers, with our recruitment teams and our employers about avoiding implicit bias, avoiding any of these other pitfalls that come into the interviewing process. And something I'm not sure everyone thinks about when it comes to training your recruitment team is also training your team or having a conversation with your team on how to network. A big part that Tim went over in the first part of this Ed Live was marketing your position. And so your recruitment team are going to be some of the biggest individuals who are marketing your position. And so being able to have a conversation on how to network as it relates to marketing a position that you have. And so they can market on social media, but word of mouth is also going to be even bigger. So as they are going to other conferences and things, and as they are networking, how can they strategically also drop that you have this position that is opening and share that with other colleagues in the field? And then I also think it's important to pull in some of your resources. So usually your human resources teams have a lot of resources as it relates to training, specifically around recruitment, because that is primarily what the human resources team does, is they are recruiting. as well as your career services team can help with some of those interview processes, how to have a conversation, and also how to talk as a team when it comes to deciding on a candidate. Those are also conversations that should be had when coming to train your team, is how are we going to have this conversation? And keeping your team updated on the process as you're going through it. And so your recruitment team should be a part of your process. You can lose your recruitment team's trust when it comes to if someone is chairing your recruitment team and they're not sharing information as the process goes on. And so remembering that it's also about building trust amongst your recruitment team, and then also training them on the laws, of course, as it relates to interviewing and how to avoid questions that are illegal. So avoiding illegal questions is a good conversation to have, but also how to understand that your recruitment team's conversations are private conversations, and so they shouldn't be shared out amongst the greater community until a final candidate is decided upon. All right, Tim, any questions, any additional insights as it relates to training your recruitment team?
No questions at this point still, so feel free to ask your questions either in the larger group or directly to me. No, but again, like Arian hit it right there, just making sure that you and your team understand like what it is that you're all looking for and that you can talk about it in a uniform fashion, and really just understanding the human resources side of your process too. I think that's sometimes where recruitment teams may not be able to understand, because each institution has a little bit of a different human resources process for things like what we're doing at TPE.
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, and I think there may be a specific training that will be different for your team as it relates specifically to how to do TPE on site. Because TPE on site, there are a few other different things that come into play. And so that is running to your candidates in the elevator, being out at a restaurant and seeing your candidates. Like there needs to be more training as it relates to specifically on site when it comes to candidate interactions outside of the interview hall, or even within the interview hall. So, seeing your favorite candidate walking with another institution, being able to have a constructive conversation with your team and say, like, avoid any kind of facials or anything towards the institution or the team as it relates to seeing your favorite candidate meeting with another team. But also having the conversation on how are we trading of who's working at the interview table and who's leaving from the interview table, especially because you're going to be in a space where a lot of other institutions are interviewing. And so training your team on also how to be courteous of those other employers that are also interviewing. And there may need to be some focused training as it relates to some of these tables our non-premium tables aren't blocked off, like they're out next to another table who is interviewing. And so really talking to your team about how to focus specifically on your candidate and not get distracted by a candidate who's behind you or across from you or beside you, because the candidate that you're currently interviewing can see anytime. I mean, I can remember my own experience at TPE at one point, and my employer was looking everywhere else but at me. And so really training your team on being able to focus on what is taking place at onsite, but also talk to your team about interacting with us specifically as the TPE team that is around. Like if your team has questions, there is going to be someone from our team wearing a blue vest or black vest who is around at TPE to also assist your team in whatever you need. And so just understanding that there's one part of training your team as it relates to recruitment overall, but then your specific team that you are bringing to onsite may need further training as it relates to specifically being at onsite and being in that space, and understanding that candidates will be around them at all times. And so how to manage that as an interviewer as well. And then there may be a deeper conversation as you also may be having some of your recruitment team who are also candidates. And so having another conversation with them, whether it be separately or with the team as a whole, on how to navigate that you are on both sides of the table, and that you are serving as a recruiter for our institution, but you're also a candidate for other institutions that are taking place. So also navigating the piece of you may be sitting in the candidate waiting room with some of the candidates that we're interviewing. And so how to navigate those questions and those conversations and how to pull out of the employer role when you're in the candidate role. So those are just some suggestions on some other topics of training that you may need to do with your specific recruitment teams or members of your recruitment team, depending on how your attendance at TB on site, and then who from your team is attending as employer, candidate, or just employer for on site. And then another area that we find very important that can often get left out and that we hear the most feedback from our candidates as it relates to is candidate communications. I like to think that communication with your candidates is imperative to your process as a whole. How your process, the feedback from your process, for one. Some institutions will do feedback on their process as it's going, but the biggest feedback you'll get on your process is gonna come from your candidates. And so one big thing that they always talk about is communications from employers. And so if you think back to your own experience as a candidate, searching for a job, there probably has been one job out there that you've applied for and you never heard anything back 6 to 8 months later once they've hired a candidate. And so that is something that we hear about a lot. And so when you're thinking about candidate communication should be built into your timeline from the beginning. So as we talked about building your timeline and what are your interview steps and processes, you also need to build in when are we communicating with our candidates. That also may be a conversation with your human resources, because some human resources departments will do all of your candidate communications. Other institutions, they only communicate when the application opens, and then they communicate again once a candidate is hired. And so you will need to talk to your HR team to understand what you're allowed to do. Some institutions are allowed to do their own communications in between. So really need to talk to your HR team to figure out what can we do. And then based on what you're allowed to do from HR, build your process. And build a process that has prompt follow-ups. So the picture you see on the screen is an example of how I run my recruitment process. As soon as a candidate applies, we send this to them. So before we even post the job, we develop our timeline of communication with our candidates. And so we send them the full communication timeline as soon as they apply, so that they know when they're going to hear back from us, and they can plan around that, knowing that more than likely they're not only applying to our position. So if they receive an offer before we're even screening applications, they know where they are in our process, as well as we know how many rounds we're doing. So we only do a first round and then on campus, but giving them a timeline of this is when you will hear from me next. So they don't have to, there's always that feeling of anxiety as a candidate of, I don't know if I'm gonna hear back. I don't know when I'm gonna hear back. They send an email trying to figure out when they're gonna hear back, and then no one responds to the email. And so how can you build it into your timeline from the beginning of when are you communicating with your candidates? To make that easier, or that process easier, I would suggest you build templates. And so have a template. So this email that you see in the picture, that is a template email that all I have to do is change the dates. Whenever we have a new process, this is the process we're going to follow. I just got to change the dates. Then you can have a template email that you have saved somewhere for every step of your process communication, whether it's your thanks but no thanks email for each round, whether it's your we'd like to offer you an interview for the next round email, or it's your congratulations email. Like, you can have all of those emails drafted now so that you only have to change a few things in your communication, which makes it easier because, as I said earlier, your job doesn't stop because you're running a recruitment process. And so you don't have to go back and try to recreate the wheel or recreate these communications. There may be some unique communications as candidates are sending you questions throughout the process. But that's also something you can think about with your recruitment team, is that you may have an individual or a few individuals in your recruitment team who are overseeing your communications with candidates, so that there is prompt communication happening from your candidates. It makes a difference in your process because these individuals eventually will become your colleagues. And it makes it easier on your colleagues as well, because I'm pretty sure that while you're communicating with candidates, there's also probably individuals in your department, on your campus, who are also asking questions of, when are we going to hear this? When are we going to hear this? When are we going to know that you've hired a candidate? So having these communications also are useful, not just for your candidates, but for your campus partners. But it is a suggested kind of timeline that your candidates don't go more than maybe 3-4 weeks max without hearing from you and without knowing. Another piece is that if you are changing any parts of your timeline, so you may send out an email in the beginning and give your dates, and then we know things happen on campus. Something may take place that you need to move a date, push something back, move it earlier. Again, that comes with communication to your candidates. And so just letting them know, so that way, whatever other processes they're running into, they are able to know where they stand in yours, or if they're going to hear back from yours, and how that falls in line with other campuses that they are interviewing with. Also, when thinking about your candidate communications, you want to think about how you plan to communicate with them. Some institutions will do only emails until they get to the offer stage. Others will call for each step of the interview process. So offering first round interviews, offering second rounds, and offering on-campus interviews. And so you want to determine also in your timeline how you plan to communicate with candidates at each step, and if you decide to share that information from the beginning. And then just as a thought process with your candidate communications, as you're developing them, always put yourself in the candidate's shoes. So as you're developing something, go back to, if I was a candidate, what else would I want to know right now? What else do I need to know right now? So even, for example, when we send our on-campus interview offers, we say in that communication from the beginning what we'll be covering, what the candidate needs to cover, how payment, reimbursements, where they'll be staying. So as much information that you can give a candidate at each section of your interview process, I would suggest that you give that to them, because it helps to lessen the anxiety that candidates have as it relates to each step of your process. All right, so I will take this time again to allow Tim to, if there are any questions or if you have any additional pieces as it relates to candidate communications.
No questions from the audience, but I would say this is probably the piece that we hear all the time from candidates and even employers too, because you may develop like all these great templates, but then a candidate isn't responding back to you. So I would say making sure that you have all of these different communication pieces put together, just like what Arian has done here in the picture for their institution. Whatever that needs to look like for you all is going to be best, because I think that is just something that we always hear back from candidates, like, well, this employer, I emailed them and they never got back to me. I also think with candidate communication, especially if you're going to be doing a majority of it via email, making sure that you're putting the correct email address that they should be addressing their questions to. So in Arian's picture, it looks like there's a generic email that's probably filtered into a different inbox that someone on the recruitment team might be checking. So if your team is set up that way, where there is like a generic email like work with us at scu.edu, then someone on my recruitment team will be checking that like once a day or a few times a week. So making sure that you're putting the correct email addresses. And then really just to reiterate, if something does change in your process to where you either have to shift interviews or on campuses or shift around some things, I think making sure that you as an employer are communicating that out pretty quickly to your candidates, especially the ones as you get closer to that on-campus stage, if you have to shift any of their on-campus dates because of another thing going on campus that needs to take a little bit of your attention at this point. So I would say candidate communications are probably super, super important as an employer. They're probably second to the questions that you develop. Because that is a question that we get a lot from candidates, like, well, how long is too long before I communicate with an employer since I haven't heard back from them? And I'll tell you a personal anecdote, there have been jobs that I've applied for years ago that I still haven't found out if they've even closed the application. So it could just be something in their system, but making sure that you have some sort of plan, even if you can't put it into writing as necessarily as Arian has done, at least being able to have it mentioned as part of your interview process, saying, here's the dates that we are looking to do for this portion of our process. Should you have questions, here's the email address. So if you can't put it in writing, at least make sure that your entire team is aware of what the communication outline looks like for candidates.
And speaking of the generic kind of email address for your department, I would highly suggest it if you're able to make one rather than giving it to a specific person. That way it's sustainable as positions change. And so the individual who's running a recruitment process this year may not be the same next year. And so you can keep your materials very similar because it's going to one email inbox, but also you're able to save things in that email inbox for the next year. Or a cool trick that I've heard some employers do is that they save all of their candidate template communications as signatures. And so they're able to quickly pull a signature that is the full email that they need to send. And that way it's also saved somewhere so that you can access it from any computer, that you're able to access that email rather than saving it to a document, having to copy and paste. And so that is just a useful trick that we've heard from different employers while working in the field as it relates to their recruitment processes and the sustainability of recruitment processes, especially if you know that you have positions that are high turnover. So especially those areas that have a lot of employees that are doing the same role, such as in residence life.
So as we wrap up our time today, we wanted to give you some things to think about in December. Remember, early bird registration ends on January 10th, 2020. I think if you're able to solicit feedback from other stakeholders about your previous process as you're building your teams, I would also say in the month of December, solidifying your TPE on-site team. That's going to be really important because from January 10th to the 12th, and when you have to order your tables, to the 20th, when you have to input your interview teams, it's going to be a pretty quick turnaround once we begin the new term in January. This is also a great time to review your position descriptions, especially if you are an institution that has to have your position descriptions signed off by either your director or a dean or someone higher in a higher level position. Understanding your candidate communication plan. So as you review your position descriptions, figuring out what your communication plan is going to be. Also looking at your recruitment budget. I think that's also really important, making sure that you know that if your budget can only sustain 4 people going to TPE on-site, that is the number of people that you are bringing on-site. Some other things to consider are, like Arian said, we are continue to create and update your interview questions is going to be very important. Then also soliciting the information about from your campus partners as to who needs to be involved from a campus partner perspective, because I think that'll be very important, especially if you have a high number of campus partners that are involved traditionally in your process, making sure that they are that they know what's going on within the process. Let me. Yes. So sorry about that. I don't know how the screen got off, but here you go. So yes, campus partners, to make sure that they are involved. And then again, these upcoming dates. So like I said, early bird registration ends on the 10th of January. You'll want to make sure you're finalizing your table orders and then adding your interview teams by the 20th. So like I said, as we get closer to the beginning of the new term, the dates for the interview teams come really, really fast. And then scheduling will open on February 1st. So in our next ED Live, we'll be talking about the actual logistics, about what this has to look like. And then any of your interview hall service needs is also due around the 21st. Yes, someone asked if the PowerPoint in the first session's PowerPoint will be made available to everyone. It is. It's also available on our YouTube page, and we will make sure to link that when we make our social media posts. Thanks for asking. So in an effort to make sure that our employers are receiving continued support, Arian and I, will be delivering concierge hours. And so these are individual support to employers and recruitment teams. answer any TP on-site related questions, and relay pertinent information. And so all of our concierge hours will begin Monday, January 6th, 2020, and they will be weekly. So concierge hours for Arian are Monday and Wednesdays from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then my concierge hours will be on Tuesday and Thursdays from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So should you want to do more of an individual one-on-one, we'd be more than happy to do it on the days that we have listed here for concierge hours. But really, these hours are just to make sure that we're answering your questions and really providing employers our support, especially for all the employers that are going to be on site with us. So we want to make sure that you all have that information. There will be more information about it to come, but we wanted to make sure we got this out there to you all, so that way you can begin planning or asking any questions that you might have, or if you're in the beginning stages, to start really looking at what's been effective, what has worked for the past. So the question that came in, will there be any session on how to create a successful social at TPE? Yes. Once we get to January, really in January and February, we're really going to be talking about the logistical parts of TPE onsite and the employer development experience, which includes creating successful socials, because that is one of the areas that the employer development team oversees as part of the process. And based on our meetings, we have a lot of employers who are interested in doing the socials at TPE, which is awesome, because we always love connecting with employers outside of the interview hall and seeing them interact with the other candidates. So yes, we will have part of our session that talks about the socials at TPE. Are there any other questions? Arian, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think that kind of covered everything. Some of your questions that were detailed in the registration, some of those questions are future lives that we'll do. So social specifically as it relates to, and then some other questions that came up specifically as it relates to being first-time employers at TPE, and not really knowing what exactly to do. That is where it will be perfect to have those kind of concierge hour times with Tim and I, to really have a one-on-one conversation as it relates to how to be a first-time employer, knowing that Tim and I have both gone through as candidates and employers at TPE. So we kind of have that experience. And then on the other hand, looking at all of our previous webinars that we've done so far this semester that really talk about, registering for TPE and some things to think about right after you register, and then with the first part of the conversation as it relates to the recruitment process.
Yeah, we have a lot that's going to be happening in the next couple of months, and we're super excited to really kick off our concierge hours when we get back from the new year. But should you have any other questions, we have all the social media links posted right here, as well as the employer email, should you have any directed questions for us in particular. So as we get out concierge hour information, we'll be posting it via our social media. So please make sure that you're following us on Facebook, on Instagram, and on the Twitter, so that way we can answer any of your questions.
But other than that, we really thank you all for coming out today, and just hope that as we're preparing and getting closer to TPE on site, that we are answering whatever questions you have to make that experience as smooth and as successful as possible for you.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. Should you have any questions, feel free to email us. Alrighty, well, I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Have a good day.